Let's get a week 3 win in fantasy football easily. This video is going to give you everything you need to know about every single starting running back and whether you need to start or sit them based on isolated RB and defense statistics, game trends, and the video gets crazier as we go through these players and the list gets lower and lower and lower. So make sure to stick around for the end of that. Please go down and subscribe to the channel if you do enjoy this video and hit that like button while you are down there. It helps me out a ton, and as a creator, I'd love to see you guys for the remainder of these videos all season. But the S tier, these top 3 or 4 running backs honestly are all very similar in high ceiling, high floor, and just great starts every single week. So I'll go through them relatively quickly. Bijan Robinson is the #1 running back against the Chiefs this week. They do get a tougher matchup. They allow the 16th most points to opposing running backs, so it's not negative, it's not necessarily positive either. You're coming off another game with over 100 all-purpose yards. The offensive line has been playing a lot better, which has allowed Bijan Robinson to average 16.2 fantasy points over 2 weeks without scoring a touchdown yet. When that does happen, he's going to be a 20+ fantasy point scorer every single week in and week out. And Breece Hall is going to be the RB2 this week, getting a tougher matchup against the Patriots, but his pure involvement as a receiver out of the backfield, he runs a ton of routes, is going to keep him this high in the rankings. He's averaging 7 targets and 7 receptions out of the backfield over 2 weeks. Even with Braylon Allen getting some kind of involvement from last week, I'm not too worried about it. The last time Breece played this team, he had 37 rush attempts for 178 yards. I'm not saying that's a guarantee for this week, but the history shows it should be a positive game script for him here. The next guy that he's tied up here with is Jordan Mason. Again, climbing up the rankings every single week. This guy is averaging 23 rushing attempts per game on 5.15 yards per carry. That is insanely efficient. I'd love to see him get more usage in the pass game. That's really the only thing keeping him from being a lock of top 3 every single week. And if he doesn't score his touchdown, then he's probably going to get 14 to 15 fantasy points, and he has scored 2 in 2 weeks. So there is a little bit of some red flags, but he does get an amazing matchup against the Rams, who are allowing 24 points to running backs this year, top 5. Keeping it in the S tier though is going to be Alvin Kamara, a guy coming off a 4 touchdown week, but the entire offense really just has been clicking, and he gets a matchup against the Eagles, who allow the 4th most fantasy points this year, as well as 6 yards per carry on average. They're not great at stopping the run, and it's great to see that through 2 weeks, Kamara is that guy everywhere on the field. We had some worries about Taysom Hill coming in and taking some touchdowns. He's barely been seeing 15% of the snaps. Kamara is projected for 5 receptions this week, all those yards on top of the 70 rushing yards that he's also projected. He's the RB3 in red zone usage so far this year. I mean, you can tell when he has 4 touchdowns in a game. But keeping it in the S tier, we're going to be going with Saquon Barkley. This is a guy that gets probably the toughest matchup out of all of these top 4. The Saints are allowing some of the least points to opposing running backs so far this year, and they just have a tough defense in general. But you look at these numbers and it's a little bit more skewed than you'd actually think, because they played against a split backfield in Zeke and Rico Dowdle, and they also got Chuba Hubbard, so it's not the best running back competition. The Eagles have a great offensive line. Saquon Barkley is a good pass catcher. Jumping it down to the A tier is going to be Jahmyr Gibbs. He gets a decent matchup against the Cardinals. They have a good run defense, but the rest of their defense just is not great. They do allow a ton of points, and the game should swing massively towards the Lions. They have not been great in the red zone, which is part of the reason why Sam Laporta has had a really slow start this year. But for 2 weeks in a row, this Lions game is projected for some of the highest game totals of the week. So if there's going to be a lot of points scored, Jahmyr Gibbs is probably going to be a good fantasy player. He gets a ton of usage in the receiving game as well to keep that floor high. But speaking of high floors, Jonathan Taylor is going to be next here, and he's been pretty unlucky. The Saints offense just has not been predictable so far, and he has the least amount of carries in the 4th quarter out of any other RB1. But it looks like this is a get-right game for him against the Chicago Bears. They are top 10 in points allowed to the running backs. With the struggle they continue to have, the Colts should be able to lean more on Jonathan Taylor and this run game, which means great game for JT. Again, receiving upside as well. And I have Devon Achane next in this A tier, and you might be looking at this thinking this seems a little bit high. We do have Tua on IR. That shouldn't really be a worry to move him down your rankings a ton, which is why I haven't. We see last week an example. Malik Willis was filling in for Jordan Love. We thought that offense was going to be a complete throwaway, and the game was not going to be good. And then we have Josh Jacobs come out here and see 32 rushing attempts. The team in total had 50 rushing attempts combined with jet sweeps. Their game plan was to just get the ball out of Malik Willis's hand, and it worked pretty well. So I assume the same thing to be going here with the Dolphins. When you have Skylar Thompson, you have some great receiving threats as well. They're obviously going to be used, but when you have a great running back in Devon Achane, you're also going to be using him and taking that pressure off Skylar to make those good throws. Will that make Achane a little bit less efficient because defenses know that? Probably. Is that going to be an issue? No. You can also bet on that check down game again. Last week, 7 receptions for 70 yards. That is insane. We're likely to not have Raheem Mostert again for this week. Keeping it here to a guy we were just talking about, Josh Jacobs. This is subject to change if Jordan Love is missing this week, but it looks like he is on track to play. I talked about it earlier. 32 rushing attempts, 117 yards average over the last 2 weeks. Marshawn Lloyd is on IR now, so there's even less running back competition. And I'll double up on this, coming with James Conner next. He's coming off a great game last Thursday. There's always going to be that can't worry that Josh Allen takes his rushing touchdowns. But in a great matchup against the Jaguars, outside of their internal issues with Trevor Lawrence not playing as good as he should, and now we have Evan Ingram injured, they allow some of the most points to opposing running backs. The Bills are also projected to win this game by about a touchdown. Should be a run-heavy script. James Cook gets involvement in the receiving game too. And we're taking James Conner next here in the rankings. This one, again, is a little bit tough with the defensive situation. They get the Lions, who have not allowed a RB1 to go over 70 rushing yards in 23 games. That's a pretty crazy statistic, and we talked about it last week. It held true again. But considering how good James Conner has been playing in this matchup, has a 50-point game total, there should be a lot of scoring and a lot of opportunities for him to get those fantasy points. And here we go with Derrick Henry inserting himself into this ranking. We've learned that he's more of a game script dependent running back, not in the fact that we won't be starting him, but in the fact that we know what to project with him. And despite what looks like a bad matchup against the Cowboys, they've actually been pretty decent and pretty positive against allowing running back points. And they just can't stop the run game. If we look at their first 2 weeks, 93 rushing yards and 1 touchdown in week 1, then 190 rush yards and 4 touchdowns in week 2, obviously against Alvin Kamara and the rest of those guys. We should not be hesitant about Henry in the sense that the Ravens cannot start 0-3. I don't expect them to have any type of limitations against Henry this week. They need to win. They got to get him the ball. It's a positive matchup. He will most likely score his touchdown and get almost 20 touches. But I can't keep dropping Kyren Williams even in a really negative matchup against the 49ers run defense, and they have no Cooper Kupp and no Puka, so this offense is going to be a little rusty. We're playing him off the upside of the checkdown game. There should be even more potential for that with these receivers being out. Somebody's going to have to get the ball to keep this offense moving. If we're trusting Demarcus Robinson and Tutu Atwell, keeping it on a guy, Ramondre Stevenson, somebody everybody has been hating on but continues to prove people wrong. He's been seeing a lot of usage, 23 touches in week 2 and 28 in week 1. But the problem is he gets what looks like a tougher matchup against the Jets, which it is a tough matchup, but to be fair, they are tougher against the pass than what they are in the run game. So they should lean on the run game. The Patriots aren't generally a pass-heavy team to begin with. Ramondre Stevenson does get work out of the backfield. He runs a ton of routes. That will probably be there to help Jacoby Brissett. And they call up run plays on 61% of their offensive snaps. So that's a pretty good situation, especially if you don't have a ton of Antonio Gibson. I do expect him to get a little bit more involved in this matchup against the Jets because it is tough, but Ramondre is still a top start every week. But looking at Travis Etienne, this is a guy that definitely has some red flags pretty much everywhere. On the offense, they have the third worst third down conversion rate. There's been a ton of fumbles. They have, as a team, a pretty bad red zone conversion rate. And now we have Evan Ingram dealing with injuries, so there are some drawbacks. But what most of that does is lean more towards the run game in a matchup against the Bills. The only problem is that they're projected to lose by a touchdown, so you'd hope Travis Etienne gets a ton of usage in the pass game to keep him afloat and keep him having a high floor. A bit of a jump from the expected here is Tony Pollard. This is a guy that's been averaging 16.6 fantasy points through 2 weeks. I guarantee you nobody expected that. And now he has a good matchup against the Packers, who are top 7 in fantasy points allowed to the running back position. We also do have Tajay Spears questionable with an ankle injury. It does look like he is going to be good to go for week 3, but if he's not, that makes Tony Pollard even better of a player because he gets a ton of usage in the pass game as well. If you see a theme here, all of these top guys have pass game utilization. It keeps their floor a lot higher. And I will be going ahead and putting Zach Charbonnet next in this ranking. He gets a great matchup against the Miami run defense, who are top 10 in fantasy points allowed and yardage allowed to running backs. And I am taking this ranking in consideration that Kenneth Walker probably won't play this week. He is questionable. The Seahawks have said that they want to play it safe with him and they don't want to throw him in too early. He did not practice on Wednesday, so it looks like he's not going to play. But with that being said, Charbonnet is still going to be a top guy that we can be putting in our lineups. He was the RB8 last week. He did that through 100% of the touches out of this backfield, 14 carries, 5 receptions. He has a lot of utilization in the pass game, which we know and which we love to see. He's been a pass-catching running back since college. It's just what he is really good at. It's his running back archetype. But we'll be taking a guy next year in Rachaad White that has a bit more total setbacks than he does hope. To start things off, he was limited in practice with a groin injury. There is a possibility that he will not play. He most likely will in a great matchup against the Broncos run defense. They're allowing 14.5 fantasy points a game to opposing running backs. But there is that possibility that Rachaad White comes into this game on a limited restriction and Bucky Irving gets a ton of usage, which would put Bucky Irving up in my rankings, which I'll get into later. Again, just monitor that situation, make sure Rachaad White isn't limited, and if he is, I'm moving him down my rankings. And you guys can let me know your start sit questions in the comments, and I will be answering 100% of them before Sunday's tip-off. And this next group of running backs I will put together is David Montgomery and Brian Robinson. I talked about this a little bit earlier with Jahmyr Gibbs, and that this matchup should be relatively high scoring. Monty is a bit more of a touchdown dependent running back than Jahmyr Gibbs is in their usage and their play style in this offense, especially considering the inefficiency in the red zone for the Lions. it should be a get-right game for them where they can change that up. And Brian Robinson is getting a matchup against the Bengals, who are top 10 in fantasy points allowed to the RB position. He will have some versatile usage in the pass game, a little bit in the red zone role as well, and everything else in between. The worry of Jaden Daniels and Austin Eckler in the backfield is always there, but he still should be a fine start. But a guy that you're probably questioning where he is, and definitely is a bit lower in this rankings depending on his injury, is Joe Mixon. He is questionable, does not look like he's going to play, so I'm operating under the fact that he won't. He did miss practice on Wednesday and gets a pretty tough matchup against the Vikings defense here. And if you saw the waiver wire videos earlier this week, I was talking about how Cam Akers might not be the best pickup because we do have Dameon Pierce, Joe Mixon, but now Joe Mixon is popping up on the injury report, and it looks like Dameon Pierce also will miss week 3. So if that happens, go ahead and pick up Cam Akers. He's only rostered in 10% of leagues, so it's more than likely he's going to be out there for you. I don't expect Cam Akers to just be this RB1 and nobody else is going to be healthy, but if it does happen, you're going to want to be picking him up, and you're probably going to want to put him as a fringe start considering that we have Joe Mixon this early. But the man J.K. Dobbins is on an insane tear, averaging 9.8 yards per carry over 2 weeks on 27 total rush attempts, 133 yards per game averaged. But there is some actual concern here. He gets a tougher matchup against the Steelers, who do allow the 7th least points to opposing running backs, and the possibility of Justin Herbert missing this week, which would definitely put his ranking down a bit. It's very unlikely that J.K. Dobbins continues another week of 100 yards on the ground, but when you have Gus Edwards only averaging 3 yards per carry, it's not impossible. Moving through these rankings, I do have Aaron Jones next up here in a tougher matchup against the Texans, who allow the 5th least points to opposing running backs. He will need to lean more on his receiving upside because the Texans haven't allowed an RB1 to go over 60 rushing yards in 10 games, and this could be a little bit sticky if we do have Ty Chandler getting a bit more involvement in this matchup. There is some caution. We're hoping Aaron Jones gets his usage in the red zone like he usually does if they can get there in this tough matchup, and his upside in the receiving game. But Zach Moss against the Commanders defense, they are way worse over the top and in the passing game, but their defense still is pretty bad against the run, averaging 15.5 points per game to opposing RB1s. Moss should continue to lead this backfield in usage and pretty much every single running back metric. Nothing has shown us otherwise. He saw 80% of the snaps last week, and if he can just get more than one target, he's going to be a fine start. But this is one of the few cases where I might actually be okay with starting Zamir White in our lineups. He gets a dream matchup against the Panthers, who are one of, if not the worst team against stopping running backs. They're allowing 20 plus points to opposing running backs this year. Outside of that great matchup, not saying that it's not important because that is probably the most important for Zamir White and the Raiders here. He played 63% of the offensive snaps out of the backfield for the running backs, 12 touches. The coaching staff has said that they want to get him more involved. Now, whether that's coach speak or actual game plan, we don't know. But as long as Alexander Mattison doesn't take too much of his work, which doesn't look like it's going to matter in this great matchup, he should be an absolutely fine play. Speaking of snap utilization, Jerome Ford only saw 44% of the snaps, leading to 7 carries and only 1 reception out of the backfield, but he was extremely efficient with 9 yards per carry. The unfortunate part is we do have some worry with the involvement of Foreman coming in week 2, and it looks like it's possible for that to bleed in here, which is why he is so low in these rankings, but Ford is projected for 3 receptions. You guys see a theme that PPR is going to keep their floor up, so it makes Jerome Ford still a fine play. It's a good matchup, so the Browns should control the pace of this game, leading to more rushing attempts. But looking down at DeAndre Swift, he gets a matchup against the Colts, who are struggling. They play a Colts defense that isn't necessarily that adaptable, meaning that they don't change their defense that much, so it's pretty predictable for running backs. In week 1, we saw Joe Mixon get 30 rushing attempts, and then in week 2, we saw Josh Jacobs get 32. Now, those are some of the best running backs in the NFL, so their numbers are going to be pretty good, but over 30 touches 2 weeks in a row shows some great upside for the game script for DeAndre Swift. Now, is he going to get anywhere near 30 touches? Absolutely not, but he should get more than what he gets now, which is lower than what we expected. And I'll go ahead and group these next few running backs together. We have Javonte, Najee, and Chuba Hubbard. Javonte got saved by his receiving game last week. He had 5 receptions. To be fair, it was a tough matchup against the Steelers, so you can't take that too much away from him. But he didn't have a ton of usage, and he only averaged 1.5 yards per carry. That's inexcusable. I don't care what defense you're playing against. It's a better matchup in week 3 against the Buccaneers. Still kind of a negative defense as far as allowing fantasy points go, but his snap share did increase from week 1 to week 2. There isn't really much upside though. It's scary. It's definitely a risky play. But Najee is also not in a great spot here against the Chargers, who allow the 11th least points to opposing running backs. We do have Warren getting healthier, seeing more and more snaps, which we saw from week 1 to week 2, allowing him to get more usage, and he jumped up from 2 to 9 carries last week. But then Chuba, he gets the best matchup by far compared to these other 2 running backs against the Raiders. We have Andy Dalton starting at quarterback now, so maybe that will give him some more light in the pass game, running out of the backfield, but as well just getting this offense moving and actually scoring points. a 36-year-old Andy Dalton might save this offense. That's crazy that we're coming down to that, but it looks like it might be possible. And the next few guys here is going to be Devin Singletary, Jalen Warren, and Austin Eckler. Singletary is a matchup-based running back that we will be starting. We saw and talked about that last week. He saw 16 attempts, 95 rushing yards, and a touchdown. This matchup probably won't be able to continue that because the Browns are tough. But talking about Warren, I just talked about that with Najee earlier. He's been seeing more and more usage. It's a good sign. He gets usage in the receiving game, which will be good. And Austin Eckler also deals with the issue of having other running backs taking usage out of that backfield, as well as Jaden Daniels taking some rushing work. Then I'll take Bucky Irving, P. Ryan, and Steele, this Chiefs backfield here, and give you guys the rundown on this. The Bucs do get a great matchup here against the Broncos, and if we do have Rachaad White coming into this game limited on any kind of capacity, Bucky Irving is going to shoot up these rankings a good amount. In the Chiefs backfield, I expect P. Ryan to be more of that guy to go to for week 1. We know the receiving game is going to heighten his floor a good amount, and with the Chiefs projected to pass a ton more, 25 completions projected for Patrick Mahomes. He hasn't even come close to that for the past 2 weeks. That's going to help him out if he's running more routes out of the backfield. Carson Steele is a bit more of a risky play, but he probably is going to be the RB1. I am hesitant in starting him in a matchup against a pretty good Atlanta run defense. Then we have Rico Dowdle, Zeke, Tajay Spears if he plays, Raheem Mostert again if he plays, and Ty Chandler to finish out this running back rankings. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Let me know if you guys want another tier ranking start sit video for the wide receivers coming out tomorrow, or if you'd like a more conventional start sit video talking about the matchups and the wide receivers. Let me know. I will see you guys in the next video. I appreciate you guys a lot.